The message arrived at 3 in the morning, Earth time. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was asleep in her quarters aboard the diplomatic station Valith Prime, when her communicator screamed to life. She sat up in the dark, heart pounding, and read the words on the glowing screen. A full open council session had been called. Not a committee meeting, not a subgroup discussion. A full session, broadcast live to every world in the galactic Concord. 9,000 planets would be watching. The subject of the session was listed in cold official language. Formal recitation of grievances regarding the Terran species. Elena read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Her hands did not shake, but something cold settled in her chest and stayed there. Humanity had been a member of the Galactic Concord for 43 years. In all that time, they had been treated like children, sitting at the adults' table. Every proposal Earth submitted was delayed. Every vote Earth cast was questioned. Every achievement Earth accomplished was treated as a surprise, as if a dog had suddenly learned to speak. The other species smiled at humanity in hallways and whispered about them in closed rooms. Elena had spent 15 years in galactic diplomacy, and she understood the game perfectly. Humanity was tolerated. Humanity was not respected. But this was something new. A recitation of grievances had not been invoked in over 600 years. It was an ancient ritual, older than most of the species that now sat in the Concord. It meant that humanity was not simply being criticized. It meant humanity was being put on trial. She dressed quickly and walked through the long, curved corridors of the station. Valith Prime was enormous, a city floating in space, built by the Valori, thousands of years before humans had learned to make fire. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like flowers that did not exist on Earth. Elena had once found the station beautiful. Today, it felt like a cage. The Concord Hall was the largest chamber on the station. It was shaped like a bowl, with hundreds of tiered galleries rising up from a central floor. Each gallery held a delegation from a different species. Some were tall and thin, with skin like polished stone. Some were small and covered in fur. Some floated in liquid tanks. Some had no bodies at all, and existed only as patterns of light. The diversity of life in the galaxy was staggering, and all of it was gathered here today, to look down at one small woman, standing alone on the central floor. Elena took her place at the speaking platform. She looked up at the galleries. Every seat was filled. She had never seen the hall this full. They had come to watch. The Valori hierarch opened the session. He was ancient, even by Valori standards. His exoskeleton cracked and yellowed with age. His voice, translated through the hall's systems into every language simultaneously, was dry and formal. He announced that a recitation of grievances had been formally requested and approved. Under the rules of the recitation, the accused species would hear all charges before being permitted to speak. Elena's microphone was disabled. She would stand and listen. The Dreth Collective spoke first. Their representative was a heavy creature with gray skin and 4 arms. He accused humanity of destabilizing frontier economies. Human traders, he said, moved too fast, adapted too quickly, undercut established trade networks. They were chaos wrapped in smiles. They disrupted everything they touched. The Ilhari Dominion spoke next. The Ilhari were tall and elegant, with faces that looked almost human but were too symmetrical, too perfect. Their ambassadors spoke with a voice like music and accused humanity of cultural contamination. Human stories, human music, human art were spreading across the galaxy like a disease. They were infecting other species with dangerous ideas about individuality and freedom and change. The Ilhari called it ideological poison. The Sauron theocracy followed. The Sauron were deeply religious and believed that all intelligent life should follow a single genetic template, a divine blueprint. Humanity's wild, uncontrolled genetic diversity was to them an insult to the natural order. They called it biological arrogance. They said humans were messy, chaotic, and unpredictable at the cellular level, and that this made them dangerous. One by one, more species came forward. Some accused humanity of expanding too quickly. Some accused them of asking too many questions. Some accused them of being too friendly, as if kindness itself was suspicious. The charges piled up like stones on a grave, and Elena stood beneath them all, silent, because the rules said she must. The last to speak were the Kavan Federation. This was the blow that nearly broke her. The Kavan were supposed to be humanity's allies. They had been the first species to trade with Earth after first contact. They had shared technology. They had exchanged ambassadors. Human children learned Kavan languages in school. The two species had a friendship that stretched back decades. The Kavan ambassador was a tall being with deep blue skin and eyes like black glass. He stood at the speaking platform and looked directly at Elena. He did not look away as he spoke. He accused humanity of primitive ambition, unbecoming of a sapient species. He said that humans were like animals, pretending to be civilized. He recommended that Earth's membership in the Concord be revoked and that humanity be placed under a stewardship mandate. Elena knew what that meant. Every human knew what that meant. A stewardship mandate was galactic code for subjugation. It meant another species would control Earth, control human travel, control human reproduction, control human thought. It was slavery wrapped in polite language. The hall was quiet after the Kavan finished. Not the quiet of shock, but the quiet of satisfaction. Elena looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at her, and understood something clearly. This was not a trial. This was a performance. The verdict had been decided before she ever walked in. They had brought her here to humiliate humanity in front of the entire galaxy, to make humans feel small and afraid, to break their spirit on the largest stage possible. The hierarch adjourned the session until dawn. She had not been allowed to say a single word. She was escorted back to her quarters by two Valori guards who would not meet her eyes. The corridors were empty. The station felt like it was holding its breath. Elena walked into her room, closed the door, and stood still for a long time. Then she picked up her communicator and called a number that very few people in the galaxy knew existed. It connected to a bunker beneath the city of Geneva, on Earth, where the people who planned for the worst were always awake. A voice answered. Elena spoke 5 words. "They're trying to leash us." There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice said, "Understood." The line went dead. Elena set down the communicator and looked out the window at the artificial stars of Valith Prime. Dawn was hours away, and somewhere, far away, on a small blue planet that the galaxy had just tried to cage, very serious people were opening a very old file. The bunker beneath Geneva had no windows. It did not need them. The people who worked here did not care about sunlight. They cared about information, and tonight, every screen on every wall was alive with it. Director James Okafor sat at the head of a long table and looked at the 11 faces around him. These were the senior officers of SOLCOM, the United Earth Strategic Operations and Liaison Command. Officially, SOLCOM coordinated Earth's diplomatic and military activities across the galaxy. Unofficially, it was the place where humanity kept its secrets. "You all saw the broadcast," Okafor said. His voice was calm. He was a tall man with gray hair and steady hands, the kind of person who became quieter the worse things got. The recitation, the stewardship mandate, all of it. Everyone nodded. The broadcast had been watched by every human being with access to a screen. Billions of people had seen their ambassador stand alone in that enormous hall, while alien after alien called them animals, parasites, and weeds. The anger was already building across Earth. Protests were forming in a dozen cities. People wanted to fight. Okafor did not want to fight. He wanted something much more dangerous. He placed his hand on the table, and a holographic display appeared above it. A single word glowed in the air. Prometheus. 11 years ago, Okafor said, I authorized the creation of a contingency plan for exactly this scenario. We always knew the Concord might turn on us. We always knew the older species feared our growth. Prometheus was built to give us options if that day ever came. He paused. That day is today. He opened the file. Prometheus was not a weapon. It was not a fleet. It was not a bomb. It was something far more powerful. It was knowledge. For 43 years, since the very first day humanity joined the Galactic Concord, Solcom had been quietly studying the galaxy's infrastructure. Not its warships or its armies, but its trade routes, its energy grids, its communication networks, its supply chains. They mapped every dependency, every bottleneck, every weak point in the vast machine that kept 9,000 worlds connected. They did it slowly, carefully, and without anyone noticing. The results were displayed on the screens around the room, and they were extraordinary. Human cargo ships carried 23% of all goods moving through the Galactic Core Trade Corridor. Human engineers maintained the communication relays for over 400 worlds that had never bothered to train their own technicians. Human doctors served in hospitals on 67 alien planets. Human teachers ran schools on worlds where the local species had given up on education centuries ago. Human scientists contributed to more cross-species research projects than any other single species in the Concord. Humanity had spent 4 decades making itself useful, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because that was simply what humans did. They showed up, they helped, they built things, they fixed things, they stayed when others left. And now, Solcom had the data to prove exactly how much the galaxy depended on all of that quiet, steady work. If they put us under a stewardship mandate, Okafor said, and we withdraw our people, their economy loses a quarter of its trade capacity in 6 months. Their frontier colonies lose medical support. Their communication networks develop gaps. Their research programs stall. He looked around the table. We are not going to threaten them with war. We are going to show them what the galaxy looks like without us in it. While Okafor planned in his bunker, Elena was sitting in her quarters on Valith Prime when someone knocked on her door. She opened it and found a young Valori standing in the corridor. His name was Talceris, and he worked as an attaché in the Valori diplomatic office. He was young by Valori standards, which meant he was only about 300 years old. His exoskeleton was smooth and dark, not yet cracked by age. His eyes, large and multifaceted like a dragonfly's, were filled with something Elena had never seen in a Valori before. It was shame. "May I come in?" Talceris asked. His voice was quiet. Elena stepped aside. Talceris entered and stood in the middle of the room, not sitting down, as if he did not feel he deserved comfort. "The recitation was arranged," he said. "The Ilhari Dominion and the Kavan Federation organized it together, months ago. They recruited the other species, prepared the speeches, and planned every moment. The hierarch was pressured into allowing it." Elena felt the cold thing in her chest grow heavier. "Why?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Talceris looked at her with those enormous eyes. "Because they are afraid of you. Not of your weapons, not of your ships. They are afraid of your trajectory. The Concord's population models show that within 80 years, humanity will hold enough influence to reshape how the galaxy is governed. Your species grows too fast, adapts too well, and makes too many friends. The older species have held power for thousands of years. They do not intend to share it with anyone, least of all with a species that is barely half a century old in galactic terms. So the shaming, Elena said slowly, was meant to break us. Before we became too strong to break. Yes. Why are you telling me this? Talceris was silent for a moment. Then he said, because my people brought you into the Concord. We vouched for you. We believed in your potential. What happened today in that hall was dishonorable, and I will not stand by it in silence. Elena studied him for a long time, then she nodded. Thank you, Talceris. After he left, Elena sat alone and thought. The anger she had carried since the hall was still there, but it was changing shape. It was becoming something harder and sharper, something useful. Her communicator buzzed, a message from Okafor. One word, ready. She opened the Prometheus data on her screen and began reading. Trade percentages, medical contributions, research partnerships, supply chain dependencies. The sheer scale of humanity's integration into galactic civilization, laid out in cold, clear numbers. It was not a weapon, but it cut deeper than any blade. While she read, across the galaxy, on hundreds of alien worlds, human beings were waking up and checking their communicators. They were engineers in alien factories. They were doctors in alien hospitals. They were teachers in alien schools. They were traders in alien markets. They were the people who had left Earth to live among the stars, not as conquerors, but as neighbors. They had all received the same coded message from Solcom. Not orders to fight, not orders to sabotage, just instructions to do something very simple. Talk to their alien friends and colleagues. Share the truth about what was happening. Show them the data. Remind them of every time a human had helped when no one else would. It was not a military operation. It was a conversation happening simultaneously on hundreds of worlds between humans and the aliens who actually knew them. Not the politicians, not the ambassadors, the ones who had worked side by side with humans for years and knew exactly what kind of species they truly were. Elena finished reading the data. She closed the files and opened a blank document. She had until dawn. She needed to write the most important speech in human history, and she needed every word to be perfect. She started writing. Outside her window, the artificial sky of Valith Prime was still dark, but somewhere in the distance, the first pale light of the station's simulated dawn was beginning to glow along the horizon. Time was running out, but humanity had been preparing for this moment for 43 years, even if they had not known it. Elena wrote until her eyes burned. She deleted sentences and rewrote them. She checked facts and double-checked them. She thought about every human being on every alien world who had ever stayed late to fix something, or taught someone's child, or healed someone's wound. She thought about the billions of people on Earth who had watched their species be humiliated, and were now waiting to see what would happen next. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would not grovel. She would do something much worse. She would tell the truth. Dawn came to Valith Prime the way it always did, slowly and beautifully. The station's artificial sun rising behind panels of engineered crystal that scattered the light into 1,000 colors. It was designed to inspire awe. Today, Elena barely noticed it. She had not slept. Her eyes were red and her body was tired, but her mind was a sharp, clear blade. She walked into the Concord Hall, and the noise died instantly. Every gallery was packed. There were more delegations than yesterday. Species that had not attended in years had come to watch. The broadcast was reaching every corner of the galaxy. Trillions of beings were watching their screens, waiting. Elena took her place on the central floor. She stood straight. She wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no symbols, no decoration. She looked like exactly what she was, a human being who had been told to be silent, and had spent the night preparing her answer. The Valori hierarch opened the session. His voice was formal, almost reluctant, as he announced that under the rules of the recitation, the accused species was now granted the right of reply. He gestured toward Elena's speaking platform. Her microphone activated with a soft click that echoed through the silent hall. Elena stepped forward. She placed her hands flat on the platform. She looked up at the hundreds of alien faces in the galleries above her. She took one breath. Then she began. "I want to thank the Council for yesterday's recitation," she said. Her voice was steady and calm, almost conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. It was very clarifying. For 43 years, humanity has wondered where it truly stands in the Concord. Yesterday you showed us, and now I would like to show you something in return. She turned to face the Dreth delegation. The gray-skinned, four-armed beings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Dreth Collective accused humanity of destabilizing frontier economies, Elena said. I would like to talk about the sorrel blight. The Dreth delegation went very still. 9 years ago, Elena continued, a crop disease called the sorrel blight destroyed the food supply on 3 Dreth colony worlds. 200 million Dreth citizens were facing starvation. The Dreth Collective requested emergency aid from the Concord. The request was filed, reviewed, and placed in a processing queue that would have taken 14 months to complete. She paused to let that sink in. 14 months for starving people. Human traders heard the distress calls and rerouted their cargo ships within 72 hours. They delivered food, medicine, and agricultural supplies to all 3 colonies at their own expense. They operated at a financial loss for 8 months to keep the supply lines running. Not one of those 200 million Dreth citizens starved. She pressed a button on her platform, and audio filled the hall. It was a recording of Dreth emergency communications from 9 years ago. Desperate voices calling for help. And then, cutting through the static, a human voice answering in broken Dreth language. We are coming. Hold on, we are coming. The recording ended. The Dreth delegation sat frozen in their gallery. Their lead representative stared at his own hands. Elena turned to the Ilhari Dominion. The Ilhari accused humanity of cultural contamination, she said. They said our stories and our music and our art are spreading through the galaxy like a disease. I found this very interesting, so I did some research. She pressed another button. A series of documents appeared on the hall's massive display screens. They were intercepted communications, internal Ilhari government records, trade manifests. For the past 20 years, Elena said, the Ilhari government has been secretly importing human cultural media in enormous quantities. Human films, human novels, human music. They distribute it through unofficial channels to their own population, while publicly condemning it as dangerous. Their own people love our stories so much that the Ilhari government cannot stop the demand. What they call contamination, their citizens call entertainment. What they call a disease, their people call art. Murmurings spread through the galleries. The Ilhari ambassador's perfect face showed the first crack of emotion Elena had ever seen on an Ilhari. It was fear. Elena turned to the Soran theocracy. The Soran called our genetic diversity an insult to the natural order, she said. They said we are biologically arrogant because we refuse to standardize our genome. Let me tell you what our messy, chaotic, unstandardized biology actually did. She brought up a new display, medical records, research data, planet names. 9 years ago, the Velis plague swept through Soran space. It was a virus that adapted to every species it encountered because it attacked standardized genetic structures. Every species with a regulated genome was vulnerable. The Soran were dying by the millions. Their doctors could not find a cure because every test subject responded the same way. She paused. Human doctors volunteered to help. They traveled to Sauron space at their own risk. And because human genetics are diverse, because no two humans are exactly alike, they were able to test the virus against thousands of different immune responses. They found the cure in 11 days. 11 days because our biology is messy, because we are not standardized. She read the names of the Sauron worlds that have been saved. She read each name slowly, clearly, letting each one hang in the air like a bell. The Sauron delegation was silent. Several of them had lowered their heads. Finally, Elena turned to the Kavan Federation. The Kavan ambassador sat in his gallery with his deep blue skin and his black glass eyes. He did not look away. Elena did not look away either. The Kavan called us primitives, Elena said. They called us animals pretending to be civilized. They recommended we be placed under a stewardship mandate. They were our allies, our friends, our partners. Her voice did not shake. It did not rise. It stayed perfectly level, and somehow that was worse than shouting. I would like to show the council something. She activated the final display. It was the Prometheus economic analysis, and it filled every screen in the hall with data. Trade routes, supply chains, energy networks, research partnerships, medical programs, educational initiatives, all of it mapped, measured, and quantified in perfect detail. This is what the galactic economy looks like with humanity in it, Elena said. The screen showed a complex web of connections, dense and interconnected, glowing with activity. She pressed a button. The human connections disappeared. The web collapsed. Gaps appeared everywhere. Trade routes went dark. Supply chains broke. Entire sectors of the economy showed cascading failures. And this is what it looks like without us. The hall was absolutely silent. The display showed a galaxy with holes in it, a machine missing a quarter of its parts. 23% of core trade corridor shipping, Elena said calmly. Medical support on 67 worlds, communication maintenance for over 400 planets, contributions to more cross-species research programs than any other single member. This is not a threat. This is simply the truth. You built a galaxy that depends on us, and now you want to put us in a cage. She let the data hang on the screens for a long moment. Then she spoke the words that would be remembered for centuries. You did not bring us here to judge us. You brought us here because you are afraid of what we are becoming. And you should be. Not because we will conquer you, but because we have made ourselves so necessary, so woven into the fabric of everything you are, that you will never be able to cut us out without cutting yourselves. She paused. The silence was so deep it seemed to have weight. We would have done it as your partners, she said quietly. You chose to make us do it as your equals. Elena stepped back from the platform. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She said nothing more. The Concord Hall, filled with representatives of hundreds of species, the most powerful gathering in the galaxy, was completely and utterly silent. The screen still showed the broken web, the galaxy without humanity, the machine with its heart ripped out. The hierarch looked around the hall. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and opened it again. For the first time in his very long life, he did not seem to know what to say. In the galleries, delegates were looking at each other. Some were looking at their own hands. Some were looking at the data on the screens and doing calculations in their heads. Some were looking at Elena, the small human woman sitting calmly on the central floor, and seeing something they had never seen before. They were seeing a species that had been kicked, shamed, and silenced, and had responded not with rage or tears, but with the most devastating weapon in the universe. The silence lasted for 93 seconds. Someone later measured it from the broadcast recording. 93 seconds of absolute quiet in a hall containing hundreds of alien delegations, with trillions watching from across the galaxy. It was the longest silence in the history of the Galactic Concord. The Valori hierarch broke it. He cleared his throat, which for a Valori sounded like dry leaves scraping across stone, and announced that the council would now proceed to vote on the Kavan Federation's proposed stewardship mandate against humanity. A 2/3 majority was required for it to pass. Before the voting systems could even activate, the Dreth delegate stood up. He was the same heavy gray-skinned being who had accused humanity of destabilizing economies just the day before. He stood slowly, as if his body weighed more than it had yesterday. He looked down at Elena on the central floor. Then he looked at the rest of the hall. "We remember the Blight," he said. His voice was rough. 200 million of our people are alive because humans came when no one else would. The Dreth Collective withdraws its grievance." He sat down. The hall stirred. Then the delegate from the Turali commune stood up. The Turali were a minor species, small beings with soft brown fur and wide, gentle eyes. Nobody expected them to speak. They rarely spoke at all. They were one of the youngest species in the Concord, even younger than humanity, and they had been ignored for most of their membership. The Turali delegate spoke in a high, clear voice that carried through the entire hall. 30 years ago, my world had no schools. Our children could not read. We asked the Concord for help. The request was filed and forgotten. Human teachers came to our planet on their own. They built our first university with their own hands. They taught our children for free. My daughter learned to read from a human woman named Sarah, who stayed on our world for 11 years and never asked for anything in return. The small being paused. His wide eyes were bright. The Turali communes do not withdraw our grievance. We never had one. We stand here to say that what happened yesterday was wrong, and we formally denounce this recitation as a disgrace to everything the Concord is supposed to represent. The hall erupted, not in anger, but in chaos. Delegates were standing up everywhere. The voting had not even begun, and already the coalition against humanity was breaking apart. The Salathi Union withdrew, citing human contributions to their medical research. The Brabant Republic withdrew, admitting that human engineers had rebuilt their orbital platforms after the Brabant collapse. The Nur Collective withdrew without giving a reason, their delegates simply shaking his massive head and sitting down in what looked like exhaustion. Behind the scenes, Prometheus was working. On every alien world where humans lived and worked, conversations were happening. Human operatives were sharing information with wavering delegations. Not lies, not threats, just data. Just the simple, documented truth of what humanity had done, what humanity had built, and what would happen if humanity was taken away. They also shared something else. Solcom intelligence had uncovered the real reason the Ilhari Dominion and Kavan Federation had organized the recitation. It was not about grievances at all. If humanity was placed under a stewardship mandate, the Kavan would gain control of human trade routes. The Ilhari would seize human research patents. Both species would divide human colony worlds between them. The shaming of humanity was not justice. It was a business deal dressed up as moral outrage. This information spread through the delegations like fire through dry grass. The Ilhari ambassador saw the coalition crumbling and attempted to speak. She stood in her gallery with her perfect face and her musical voice and tried to rally the remaining supporters. She spoke about the danger of human expansion, about the need for order, about the responsibility of older species to guide younger ones. But her words fell flat. The data Elena had shown was still glowing on the screens. The recordings of Dreth distress calls were still echoing in people's memories. The list of 14 Saran worlds saved by human doctors was still hanging in the air. Every argument the Ilhari made sounded hollow against the weight of what humanity had actually done. The Kavan ambassador made one last desperate attempt. He stood and spoke with passion, his blue skin darkening with emotion. He called humanity a galactic weed, a species that grew without limits and choked out everything around it. He said that if the Concord did not act now, humans would eventually consume everything. Elena did not respond. She sat in her chair on the central floor and said nothing. She did not need to respond, because someone else did it for her. The Valori hierarch, who had remained neutral throughout the entire recitation, who had maintained his species' tradition of impartiality for his entire career, stood up from his seat of office and spoke. "A weed," the hierarch said slowly, "is simply a plant that grows where the garden's keeper did not intend. Perhaps it is the garden that needs redesigning." The hall went quiet again. The hierarch had broken thousands of years of Valori neutrality with a single sentence. Everyone understood what it meant. The oldest and most respected species in the Concord had just sided with humanity. The results came in quickly. In favor of the stewardship mandate, 11 species. Against, 247. Abstentions, 89. The mandate failed. It did not just fail. It was crushed so completely that the 11 species who voted in favor would carry the shame of that number for generations. But Elena was not finished. She stood up from her chair. The hall, which had begun to buzz with conversation, went silent again. She walked to the speaking platform and requested the floor. The hierarch, with what might have been the smallest trace of a smile on his ancient face, granted it. "The Concord Charter," Elena said, "contains a provision called Article 17. It grants any member species the right to call for a structural review of the Concord's governance systems. In the 43 years since humanity joined, we have watched younger species be locked into probationary status for centuries. We have watched the same handful of elder species control every major decision. We have watched the Concord operate not as a partnership of equals, but as a hierarchy where power flows in only one direction." She paused and looked around the hall. "Today, on behalf of the United Earth Government, I invoke Article 17. I call for a full structural review." The Ilhari ambassador shot to her feet. "This is an act of war," she shouted, her musical voice cracking for the first time anyone could remember. Elena looked at her. "No," she said calmly. "War is what you are trying to prevent by keeping us small. This is what happens when you fail." The hall exploded into noise. Delegates were shouting, arguing, calling for order. The hierarch struck his ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, but the sound was lost in the storm. Article 17 had never been invoked in the entire history of the Concord. It meant that every treaty, every power structure, every hierarchy that had been built over thousands of years was now open to renegotiation. The old order was not just challenged, it was cracked open. And it was not just humanity pushing through the crack. Other species, emboldened by what they had just witnessed, began standing up and adding their voices. The Turali formally requested equal voting rights. The Brevon demanded an end to probationary membership status. The Salathi called for transparent trade regulations. Within an hour, 13 major treaties had been formally challenged by species that had been silent and obedient for centuries. The ancient machine of the galactic concord, built by elder species to keep themselves in power forever, was coming apart at the joints. And the species that had started it all was not swinging a sword. It was holding a mirror. Elena left the hall while the arguments were still raging. She walked through the corridors of Valith Prime, past groups of alien delegates speaking in urgent whispers, past screens showing her own face on news broadcasts reaching 9,000 worlds. She walked calmly and steadily, and she did not look back. Behind her, the old galaxy was burning, not with fire, but with something more destructive, with truth, and with the realization that the species they had tried to shame into submission had just rewritten the rules of civilization. By dawn, Every treaty that held the old order together was either challenged, suspended, or meaningless. By dawn, all treaties were cinders. Elena reached her quarters, walked inside and closed the door. She stood alone in the quiet room for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 2 days, she sat down and allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of what she had just done. She had walked into a trap built to destroy her species, and had turned it into the beginning of a revolution. Her communicator buzzed. A message from Director Okafor. It said, "Well done, Ambassador. Come home." She wiped her eyes, straightened her suit, and began packing her things. 3 months had passed since the recitation, and the galaxy was a different place. Not a peaceful place, not a settled place, but a different one. The way a forest is different after a storm has knocked down the oldest trees and let sunlight reach the ground for the first time in 1,000 years. Things were growing that had never had the chance to grow before, and the species that had lived in the shade for centuries were blinking in the new light and finding that they liked it. The structural review was underway. It was messy, slow, frustrating, and occasionally chaotic. Representatives from over 300 species gathered in rotating sessions on Valeth Prime, arguing about voting rights, trade regulations, membership tiers, and 100 other issues that had been buried under the old hierarchy for millennia. Agreements that had taken centuries to build were being torn apart and examined. Some were found to be fair and were kept. Many were found to be tools of control, disguised as cooperation, and these were thrown away. Elena Vasquez was at the center of it all, but she was very careful about how she stood there. She did not dominate. She did not demand. She listened more than she spoke. When she proposed ideas, she framed them as questions. When other species brought forward their own proposals, she supported them openly and loudly. She built coalitions not by putting humanity at the top, but by standing beside other species and lifting them up. This was deliberate. Elena understood something that the Ilhari and Kavan had never grasped. Power that was taken by force had to be held by force, and that was exhausting. Power that was given freely by others who trusted you was the only kind that lasted. She did not want humanity to replace the old rulers. She wanted to make sure there were no rulers at all. The Tirali communes, who had been treated as a minor and insignificant species for their entire membership, were now leading the subcommittee on educational reform. Their delegate, the same small furry being who had spoken about human teachers in the Concord Hall, turned out to be a brilliant negotiator who could find compromise between species that had been arguing for centuries. Nobody had ever given the Tirali a chance to lead before. Now that someone had, they were proving to be extraordinary at it. The Bravan Republic, freed from its probationary status for the first time in 400 years, immediately proposed a new framework for technology sharing that would benefit smaller species. The proposal was elegant and fair, and it passed with broad support. The Bravan delegate wept openly when the vote was announced. 4 centuries of being told his species was not ready for full membership, and within 3 months of being given the chance, they had produced one of the most important reforms in Concord history. Not everything was going well. The Ilhari Dominion was in turmoil. The revelations from the recitation, the intercepted communications showing their government had been secretly consuming and distributing human cultural media, while publicly condemning it, had exploded across Ilhari society. Their population was furious, not at humanity, but at their own leaders for lying to them. A youth movement had sprung up on the Ilhari homeworld. Young Ilhari were openly wearing human-style clothing, listening to human music, reading human novels, and watching human films. They gathered in public squares and shared human art with each other as an act of defiance against a government that had tried to deny them the stories they loved. The Ilhari people called it freedom. For the first time in their history, the Ilhari were having a public argument about what kind of society they wanted to be, and humanity had not started it. Humanity had simply created things that were worth caring about, and the Ilhari had responded the way all intelligent beings respond to good stories. They fell in love with them. The Kavan Federation was quieter. Their attempt to subjugate humanity had cost them enormous political capital. The species that had once been considered one of the most respected voices in the Concord was now treated with suspicion and caution. Their ambassador, the blue-skinned being who had called humanity primitives, had been recalled and replaced. The new Kavan leadership understood that something had to change. They sent a message to Earth requesting a new bilateral treaty. Director Okafor received the request in his bunker beneath Geneva, read it carefully, and forwarded it to Elena with a single note attached. Your call. Elena accepted the meeting, but she set one condition. The Kavan would come to Earth. They would sit at a human table, in a human city, under a human sky. They would come to the planet they had tried to cage and negotiate as equals or not at all. The Kavan agreed. Their delegation arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in Geneva, and was escorted to a conference room with windows overlooking the lake. Elena was waiting for them. She shook their hands, offered them coffee, and sat down to talk. She was polite, she was professional, she was warm, and the Kavan, who had expected anger or revenge, found something far more unsettling. They found forgiveness that came with expectations. Elena did not punish them. She simply made it clear that the old relationship was gone. The new one would be built on honesty or not built at all. The Kavan negotiators left Geneva 3 days later with a draft treaty that was fairer than anything they had ever signed before. It was fair because Elena had insisted on it, not for humanity's benefit, but because fairness was the point. Talceres, the young Valori who had warned Elena on the night before the recitation, had been promoted. His superiors recognized what he had done, not just the personal risk he had taken, but the moral clarity it represented. He was now the Valori's lead liaison to the structural review, and he worked closely with Elena almost every day. One evening, after a particularly long and difficult negotiating session, Talceres and Elena sat together in a quiet lounge on Valeth Prime. The station's artificial stars were glowing softly overhead. Talceres was quiet for a long time, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the light. My people brought you into the Concord because we saw potential in your species, he said finally. We thought you might be good members, reliable, useful. He paused. I do not think even we understood how much potential was actually there. Elena smiled. It was a tired smile, but a real one. We didn't either, she said. Sometimes it takes someone trying to break you to find out what you're really made of. 3 months and 4 days after the recitation, Elena stood before the United Earth Assembly in the Great Hall in New York. The room was filled with delegates from every nation on Earth. The session was broadcast globally, and beyond Earth, the galactic news networks carried it to thousands of worlds. She reported on the structural review's progress. She spoke about the new alliances forming between species that had never been allowed to work together before. She spoke about the Terali's education reforms and the Brevrin's technology-sharing framework. She spoke about the Ilhari youth movement and the Kavan Treaty. She spoke about a galaxy that was slowly, painfully, and imperfectly reshaping itself into something better. When she finished, a young delegate from the back of the hall raised her hand. She was new, barely 25, with the kind of earnest face that had not yet learned to hide its feelings. Ambassador Vasquez, the young woman said, do you believe the galaxy will ever truly accept us? Elena considered the question. The hall was quiet, waiting. She thought about the Concord Hall, about the silence after her speech, about the Dreth delegate remembering the blight, about the Teralis speaking up for the first time, about Cinders knocking on her door in the middle of the night because he believed that honor mattered more than safety. She thought about the human teachers and doctors and engineers on hundreds of worlds who had just kept doing their jobs, kept helping, kept being human, even when the galaxy tried to tell them they were less than nothing. They shamed us at dawn, Elena said, and expected us to kneel by nightfall. Instead, we lit a fire that burned every cage they ever built. Not just ours, everyone's. She paused. They do not have to accept us. They just need to understand that the galaxy they built to keep species like us down is already gone. And the one we are building together will be better. The assembly did not applaud. They did something that meant more. They stood in silence. Every delegate from every nation rose to their feet and stood without making a sound. It was the kind of silence that did not mean absence. It meant that something had changed, not just in the galaxy, but in the way humanity understood itself. Across the galaxy, on 9,000 worlds, trillions of beings watched the broadcast. Most of them had never met a human. Most of them knew humanity only through stories, through trade goods, through the music and art that had spread across the stars like seeds carried by the wind. But they all understood something that the old powers had spent thousands of years trying to suppress. The most dangerous thing in the universe was not a species with warships or weapons or armies. It was a species that, when pushed to its knees, stood up and said, "No, and here is why you need us." Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had not defeated their enemies. They had done something far more difficult and far more lasting. They had made themselves essential, not through force, but through kindness, through stubbornness, through the simple human habit of showing up and helping, even when nobody asked them to. And now the galaxy was learning what Earth had always known, that the strongest bonds were not made from treaties or laws or threats. They were made from trust. And trust was built by the people who stayed when everyone else left, who helped when no one else would, who kept building even when the world told them to stop. Humanity had not just survived the recitation, they had used it to set the galaxy free. And somewhere on HFY in a quiet office overlooking the stars, Cinders sat alone and read the transcript of Elena's speech. When he reached the last line, he set down the document and looked out the window at the vast, glittering darkness. He smiled. The new dawn was just beginning.